Welcome everybody to this webinar on the Texas Freeze 2021 and critical infrastructure. We're very happy to host this event for the Institute of Strategic Risk Management and our student network. And we have a great expert panel today, which will shortly be introduced by Joshua. What we're talking about today is how this crisis basically evolved, how the response to it has been, and what lessons learned are. And we're just going to keep an open discussion, don't want to keep it too narrow, see where it will lead us. And hopefully we'll have some insight into critical infrastructure, how much of it failed, why it failed, and how we can prevent something in the future. So I want to hand over to Joshua for the introductions.
Yes, so I'm not sure how y'all are seeing our panelists today, but firstly, we have Professor Ed Emmett, who's currently a professor at Rice University teaching transportation policy, emergency management, and I believe social policy as well. Formerly, he was a Texas House of Representative, as well as a commissioner at the Interstate Commerce Commission, and as well as a Harris County judge from 2007 to 2019, acting as the Director of Homeland Security and Emergency Management for Harris County. Next up, we have Dr. Nathan Jones, my former professor, who is a Security Studies Associate Professor at Sam Houston State University. He's worked with Georgetown University Press to put out a book called Mexico's Illicit Drug Networks and the State Reaction. He's a fellow, I believe a fellow, at the Baker Institute at Rice University, and
I'm a non-resident scholar. I used to be a postdoc scholar, and then I became a non-resident scholar.
There it is.
I just don't want to give myself a promotion or anything.
On top of that, he's worked with numerous think tanks like the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Center of Strategic and International Studies, as I said earlier, Rice University's Baker Institute, and Insight Crime. Next up, we have Randall Gurney, who is the Assistant Emergency Management Specialist Coordinator for Collin County, and he's been in that position since 2019. Before joining Collin County, he worked for the city of McKinney in Texas, serving as the Assistant Emergency Management Coordinator there. During his time with them, he served multiple disasters, including Hurricanes Gustav, Ike, Harvey, the ice storm that we all experienced in 2013, as well as a number of different tornadoes affecting Rowlett, Garland, and just, again, Collin County as a whole. And lastly, we have retired hospital and nursing administrator and former vice chair of the Texas Board of Nursing based in South Texas, Tammy Cohen. She's been with the American Red Cross since 1989, and after retiring in 2009, she took up an additional role serving as the job director for the Southwest and Rocky Mountain Division's disaster response team. In her role as job director, she's coordinated a number of ARC responses, including the latest Texas freeze, Hurricane Delta, Hurricane Hannah, Tropical Storm Cristobal, and the Anaslaka tornado, I believe. Am I saying that right, I hope?
Unalaska.
I hope those introductions did y'all justice. Firstly, I wanted to speak of just the gravity of the situation that we all experienced last month, and wanted, if you're willing to share your personal experience with that freeze. We could start with Professor Emmett.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm glad to be here today, and my personal story is going to be perhaps a little bit longer than I would like, but it's because it's got two tracks. We live in West University Place, which is surrounded by the city of Houston. It's a little enclave just west of Rice campus, and in a house built in 1988. So power went out Monday, on the Monday afternoon, late afternoon. So we lost all power at the house. We had wrapped all the pipes. We did all those things you're supposed to do, except I made one critical mistake. I did not leave the hot water running to the room over our garage. And so as a result, we did have a pipe burst outside later. But we were without power for pretty much 3 days. However, we have this cabin. You can see I'm at a cabin up in East Texas, far north Liberty County. we have a generator here, but some people drove by and said, "Oh, your generator's not running," and we were in single digits up here, and so I rather hate to admit it, but I got out and drove on the ice on Tuesday morning just to come up here and be sure the cabin was okay, and I was going to man this, and my wife was going to stay at West U. Well, I got here and the generator was running just fine, and within 2 hours, the generator shut off and the power came back on. And so I was stranded here with full power, a freezer full of food, and my wife was left at home in the middle of Houston without power and without water, or without hot water. Why did that occur? Well, I had no idea, except for the fact that the cabin's not in ERCOT. The cabin is in MISO, which is the Mid-Continent Independent Service Operator. And so we didn't have the outage. And this little part of East Texas and parts of the Panhandle and parts of West Texas managed to escape. What's interesting about that story, and what everybody needs to, I think, take away from it, before that, I'm a fairly engaged person. I didn't know about MISO. I didn't know what the boundaries of ERCOT were. And I don't think most people understood the difference between power generators, power suppliers, and the ones who actually deliver it, like CenterPoint in Houston, who don't have any control over what the power is coming in. So there's a lesson to be learned here. And I think it's hard to say because so many people suffered, but I think this is going to be a good thing long run, because it's going to make people pay more attention to the grid and to the reliability of it. And it's not a whole lot different, and I'll save the story about New London, Texas for later, but it's the same kind of thing where a disaster happens and good comes out of it. So that's my story.
Dr. Jones, I know you're also in the greater Houston area. What was your experience like?
We fortunately only lost power for approximately 13 hours. And I too, like Professor Emmett, went to war with, I called it going to war with the pipes. And I wrapped the pipes. I did research online. I watched videos of what do people in cold weather areas do before there's going to be one of these massive freezes. And one of the things that you find is, and I talked to my German exchange mother about this after the fact, but what people in cold weather areas do is they go out to their garage and they turn the valve to their outdoor faucets, and then they drain those pipes. And like many Texans, I had the experience of going out to my garage and looking for that valve and not finding that valve because that valve isn't there. And then asking my neighbors, do you have a valve in your garage so that you can drain the pipe? They go, no, we don't have that. And my house is a relatively new build. It's a 2016 build. And so fortunately the insulation was very good. And so we only losing power for 13 hours. The heat didn't drop that much, but I was wrapping rags around and duct tape around the outdoor faucets. I was opening up all the cupboards, and I was trickling the water, and the sink that's furthest away from where the water enters the house also was the children's bathroom. So it was checking on the 7-year-old and the 5-year-old to make sure that they were leaving the water trickle on and all of those things. And fortunately, we had no burst pipes. The war was successful with the pipes. But I feel blessed, but I was getting text messages from my students who were sending me pictures of them gathering wood and burning wood so that they could, on a grill, heat soup. That it had gotten that bad very quickly over the course of days where they were losing power. And like Professor Emmett, I also had an experience. I moved in the last 2 years. And I called it moving from one civilization to another, even though I'm only moving 20 miles. And I believe that I'm on ERCOT. I believe that I'm not on MISO here, but I moved from a place that had power to choose, a deregulated area where I had the experience of regularly choosing my power contract. and looking for the best price. And my wife had a joke. She said, the only time you're allowed to flirt is if you're negotiating a better electricity price. And I would hustle on the phone trying to get the best electricity price. And then I realized at some point that the utility, there was still a base fee being charged. So no matter how much I negotiated this price, there was always 4 cents per kilowatt hour base fee in there. When I moved to an area that had a regulated monopoly, I had no choice. I asked them the price and they quoted me the price. And I said, but what's the base fee? And they go, no, that's the price per kilowatt hour. The price was so low that I was shocked. It cut my bill in half. I moved from a 2-bedroom apartment to a 3,200 square foot house and paid less in electricity. I was shocked. I had expected to move to a monopoly area and pay 10 to 20% higher regular rates, but have less price volatility. That was my expectation. That is not what happened. My rates went down. And that's an anecdotal experience, but I'll talk later about the Wall Street Journal study and various other studies that show that Texans overpaid by $28 billion since roughly 2004. And so I'll leave my comments there. But like Professor Emmett, I've had experiences in 2 different portions of Texas. So the experience was highly localized. And I want to make that point.
And thank you, Dr. Jones. Tammy, what was it like down in South Texas, since I know you're based in that area? You go up to Houston every now and again, but South Texas is really your home base.
We were fortunate at our house. We did not lose any power at all. When we built our house, I put a fireplace in. And I grew up in Iowa, so I was kind of used to extreme cold winters. And I said, I want a fireplace. And I was laughed at by everybody of, why do you want a fireplace in South Texas? You'll never use it. We actually used our fireplace, and it's gas fireplace. And so, but we had people around us that didn't have power. And so we said, if something happens and, and we lose our power, we at least will have a fireplace, so you can come over. At least the house will be warm in one part of the house with that. So the only other damage that we really had, other than it was a bad freeze, was after it passed. My husband was starting to clean the yard last week, and he smelled gas outside. We had a gas meter coming into the house. Well, apparently, when they put a gas meter in, we didn't know this, but they have to treat that meter as it goes down into the ground so that it doesn't erode and leak gas. Well, apparently when they put the meter in, they didn't treat it completely. And so we had a small leak at the bottom of where the gas line came up to go into the meter itself. And so this.
Oh, did we... Tammy, are you still there?
I think she froze on us.
Oh, no. In the meantime, I guess we can transition over to Randall. Randall, you and I are both in North Texas. I'm Collin County's intern. You work for Collin County. So what was your personal experience like?
And
sorry, we got her back.
Okay, I'm sorry. And so
no, we just got you back.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
Every region in Texas had to prepare for the cold. And so we spent the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday prior to the storm coming in, which started coming in on Sunday morning, throughout the state of Texas, preparing and pre-positioning. Traditionally, Red Cross does not open shelters for freezes. We do warming centers if it's going to be a really bad freeze. And what that means is we open something for like a 12 to 24 hour, and it's just a place for people that maybe get stranded in their cars or something like that to go to. That's what we were thinking, and that's what we prepared for, was to open up these warming shelters all over the state. Something in the neighborhood, we ended up opening well over 100 of those warming shelters throughout the state. So, but once the storm hit and everybody started losing power, because we're in a COVID environment, a lot of this is done virtually now. And we lost our ability to really communicate with each other. And that created a lot of obstacles for us to operate over the next 7 days until as things got restored back to proper electrical connectivity. That was kind of my experience at high level.
Yeah, thank you. Lastly, Randall, would you mind sharing your experience with the freeze up here in North Texas?
Absolutely. Actually, my experience was kind of a mixture of everybody's. We were very blessed. We did not lose power at my house. Well, we lost it for an hour Sunday night into Monday morning. I'm also in a regulated market. I'm on what they call a co-op. So Encore, which is big up here, does not distribute power to my house, and I don't have the right to choose. But like Dr. Jones, I have found it actually to be less expensive that way, and you're not playing the game all the time. But anyhow, we did not lose power. We prepared for it personally, making sure we had enough food and all of that. We have a 2-year-old at home. In the event we couldn't leave, because that was really what we were planning for. I'll be honest, I didn't really plan for long-term power outages because we were being told rolling blackouts, but nothing major. We lost it Sunday night, got it back on, never lost it again. Even with having power, I still had some pipes freeze in my home, mainly ones on the exterior walls because, like Houston, even up here a little bit further north, we don't have a lot of homes don't have the ability to turn off and drain the outside spigots. But we did have some freeze up. Thankfully, it's a more modern home, so it's not copper. It's a different type of plumbing, so we didn't have anything break. Really, my first couple of days, kind of jump over to the professional side, were pretty quiet. Not a lot. That Sunday, ooh, it's pretty, it's snowy out. Monday, ooh, it's cold out. But then Tuesday up here, things really started to change. People started realizing real quick, hey, this isn't going to be rolling blackouts. You're going to be without power for a while for a lot of different reasons. We had a couple communities here in our county, a couple of our smaller communities that their generators on their pump stations failed. So they still had water coming in, but they had no way to get it to their water towers or distribute it. So they ended up in water issues there and helping those folks out and just dealing with those things. We do have a fireplace. Even with us having our central heat and all that going, we still kept our fireplace going, a good bit of it, just to kind of take that edge off the house because it was cold. Our homes up here aren't built for single digits and zeros for any length of time. But we were blessed, didn't lose the power, didn't have the issues that a lot of others experienced. There's lots of theories of why. We have a fire station across the street, and then we have a hospital about a mile south of us. And everybody in there is, oh, that's why we didn't lose power. But after talking to Encore and even talking to our co-op through work means, they basically said we had to shut so much off the grid so quickly, it didn't matter what we had listed as critical infrastructure, what you told us it was. We had to shed so much. We shut off anything and everything to hit that number so we wouldn't collapse the overall grid, which became challenging. I just think we got lucky and weren't part of that. So that was our experience at home.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your experience, Randall. Just hearing all of your stories, you really feel like the gravity of the situation. Texas isn't built for the cold for, again, any length of time. And with that in mind, Randall and Tammy, would you guys mind sharing a bit more about the response efforts? Randall, we can begin with you from that government side, knowing that you're an active emergency manager.
Absolutely. Kind of like Tammy said, typically during winter weather events, we do not open shelters. And that's for us, it's a lot of different reasons. Collin County is a little bit different than Harris County. In some of the counties, around the state where most of our population is actually in city propers, home rule city propers. So they they control their destiny on those type things. We only have about 50,000 people, which isn't a lot, spread across about a quarter of the county, which is about 900 square miles, give or take. So not real dense of a population in our county that we're ultimately responsible for in that unincorporated area. When I was in McKinney in 2013, a little bit different scenario, wasn't as cold. We had a lot more ice. We had a lot more power outages that actually lasted a lot longer. At its peak, we had over 12,000 customers just on our east side in McKinney. So it's about 30,000 people, give or take, without power. And the problem was it wasn't flipping a switch behind a computer like we were dealing with this once the power generation was there. It was tree limbs falling, power lines falling due to ice, and then refalling after they repaired it, once again due to ice or whatnot. And in that event, similar to this event, discussion started, do we open, do we not open? And it was determined then, we don't open. We're putting people on the roads. It's more dangerous. They're better off staying inside, bundling up. But the temperatures weren't nearly as cold. We supported some cities that did offer some warming shelters. One of the major challenges is, and this isn't a dig or a negativity about any level of government, because the event went very differently than what was projected. A lot of resources around here were not pre-positioned. Generators weren't pre-positioned. Extra water wasn't pre-positioned like we do during a hurricane. Or, when they're talking, a flooding event, a lot of times those things are pre-positioned or ready to go. And we didn't pre-position them. No one pre-positioned them for this event. So even though we needed those things, there was no way to get them here. So struggling, through some of those things. And by Friday of that week, we had more water and more generators than we knew what to do with, because everything was back on it and we didn't need them any longer. So getting them back, to where they need to be. So it's really supporting those smaller jurisdictions that needed help. There's a process in the state called the STAR, the State of Texas Assistance Request, and processing those requests from those cities through the county up to the state, and then trying to get them. But Professor Judge Emmett can I'm sure relate to this. Someone always has a back way to get something or not get something, or if you call this person, you'll get it. And on this event, that just plain didn't happen. There was nothing to get because there was nothing here to distribute. So those are our big two things, water and then also the sheltering. The other big play that came up during our event, and I mentioned it a moment ago, Encore, which is the big power distributor around here. They're not a reseller, they're the distributor. In ERCOT, we were real concerned. I forget which night it was. I think it was either Tuesday night going into Wednesday or Wednesday night going into Thursday, that they're going to have to shed more load. And the problem is they had literally shed all the load they could. And we had just got off the phone with Encore, and Encore told us, we're getting stuff up as quick as we can, but this is what we're dealing with. It's on the generation side. And I think Judge Emmett mentioned, this hopefully brings a better perspective of everybody understanding who does what on the electrical grid. But anyhow, there was talks, because they needed to shed even more, of having to shut off our water district. And our water district here in Collin County is called the North Texas Municipal Water District. It serves water and sewer needs to over 1.8 million people. It's not just Collin County. Cities are members of it, so cities don't control their own water destiny and have their own treatment plants. And the concern was if they shut that off, it wasn't going to affect just water pumping, but it was also going to affect the sanitary side of everything. Mm-hmm. And so some quick calls and meetings took place. Way above, we weren't really involved in that. It was really that elected official level dealing with, executives at ERCOT, Encore, and we didn't get to that point, thankfully. And it was pretty much said during one of our commissioners' court meetings, our county judge mentioned the options given to Encore and ERCOT were all terrible, bad decisions. There wasn't a good option, and it was like the worst of the least, or the least of the worst, and that's where we were at. Thankfully, didn't get to that. They didn't have to shed that power. But that was the big thing that became abundantly clear. We spend time and time, again, making plans and saying, this is critical infrastructure. Oh, Encore, we need you to get this on first, or please don't ever shut this facility off, or shut, this off with hospitals, with pump stations. But it became very clear they had to shed so much, it didn't matter what list existed, it was getting cut if it helped them. So from a government standpoint, those were our big pieces, deciding on those warming shelters, which some did open and we supported minimally, getting water and some food resource to residents who didn't have it, and then working with Encore, ERCOT, and big distributor or big users of power to make sure we didn't cascade into further issues. Another thing that came up, and I'll be done after this, with the water, there was a couple different things going on. Some people were simply under a boil water notice, and some people had no water coming in because the tanks were dry in their community. And those are two very different problems. One problem, you can still use, commodes and toilets, still take a bath to a point, and boil your water for consumption. And the other one is you don't have any water to do anything. And so then even prioritizing who gets what when became a play. And as we got into it, it became less of no water and became more of a boil water, which in a lot of ways is easier, larger inconvenience, for that homeowner having to boil, but, at least they have some water. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Randall. Tammy, you touched on the Red Cross response a little bit with the warming centers. Can you elaborate more on what the Red Cross did or ended up having to do during this incident?
Well, we covered 254 counties in the state of Texas. So we had quite an outreach with that. Originally, we stood up at what was called like 3 separate DRs. There was one in North Texas. There was one in Central Texas, which was the Austin, San Antonio area. And then there was the Texas Gulf Coast, which included everything from Louisiana through Houston all the way down to South Texas with that. And but it was extremely varied because each county is very different. We had some counties that are very organized. The emergency manager is a full-time employee. They are very into that process. And then we had counties that the county judge was the emergency manager as well. And so as this rolled out and water became a really big issue, we found that I had to quickly get an inventory of all the water that we had in every location within the state of Texas. We also have some great partners. Anheuser-Busch is a big one. Immediately stood up and said, you tell us where we need to put water. And we actually brought in 22 trailer loads, 53-foot trailer loads of water throughout various locations in the state of Texas that we knew we were being hit with requests for water. The requests for water that we had initially were as people lost electricity, they also lost the ability to pump the water, and therefore they lost their water into their homes. And so by people that just did not have water to eat or to even flush their commodes with that. And then we had the rural communities that were on well water. And they too, when they lost their electricity, they also lost their pumps. And they couldn't necessarily get the parts to even repair the pumps. And so that problem is still being played out in some of those rural areas at this point in time. But luckily, it's very, very few. But it was pretty much, when I looked at the whole map, it was like we didn't have water anywhere in the state of Texas. And so first priority that I had to put together was I was not so much worried about the cold, because if people were where the people were going to be, I mean, you couldn't get around. And so it's unfortunate, and we had outcomes because of that. But it was, what water do we have, and who needs it, and where do we get it? Initially, what I did was we went ahead and gave out the water that we had, particularly in Houston. We didn't have that much. I think we had 44 cases of water sitting at the chapter house in Houston that went immediately over. Half went to the county of Houston and the other half went to the city of Houston. They asked for it, we gave it to them. And that's pretty much how we partnered. We tried to work with the county governments and the cities in getting them the water, because we felt that they would have a really good idea of where that water needed to be. And so it was probably a better use of us than us trying to go out and just say, hey, we'll go here and there and do that. As the electricity started to come back on, people that were in their homes, all of a sudden, particularly in a lot of the high-rise or senior living facilities, housing projects and so forth, their pipes broke. And so they might have had a little bit of water, but once it came back on, they ended up with major breaks into the infrastructure itself. And we called them boomerangs, because they were okay, but then as stuff started coming back online, they were boomeranged right back to the beginning, which is they were not okay. And again, we had to work real closely with the cities and the counties because initially they wanted to go in and declare that these homes were unfit for them to live. But in this COVID environment and also with the cold, those people that could get out went to the hotels. And so the hotels that we normally would, in our COVID environment, put you in a hotel, we didn't have hotels to put them in. And so we ended up opening up congregate shelters for those. But and so it was very, very all over the board of what we were doing. Water was the number one problem we had. Initially, what we did was we connected Anheuser-Busch directly with either the cities or the counties and delivered that water straight to them. We had to teach some of the elected officials how to actually fill out the STAR request that Randall mentioned. And that's the request because, they were looking at, they needed 100 trailers of water, well, we don't have 100 trailers of water that we could just give them. And so, initially I was able to get 22 trailers delivered in the first 3 days. Subsequently, I ended up getting an additional 15 trailers that we spread throughout the state of Texas. But we taught a lot of the elected officials how to fill out their STAR requests and to get that into the state. We then reached over to the counties and cities and said, hey, we'll help you distribute the water. We've got volunteers that can help distribute the water. But it was number one, the resource was not there. The water was not available in the state of Texas. And it was critical with that.
Yeah, thank you, Tammy. Professor Emmett, would you like to add something?
I would, because recognizing that we have a lot of students on this call, I'm going to put on my professorial garb here and realize that I don't think a lot of people realize the role of the county judge. After 9/11/2001, the Texas legislature decided that there needed to be one person in each county who's in charge during a disaster. You can talk about mayors and all these others, but it's the county judge in each county that is the director of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, period. And so that's why you had a lot of county judges in a place like Harris, third largest county in the United States. We have a full-time professional operation, really second to none. Collin County has a great professional operation, I'm sure. The major counties do. But a lot of the other counties, as Tammy mentioned, the county judge is the director of Homeland Security. And rather than hiring an emergency management coordinator, they serve that role too. And so they may not have that expertise. And so it's important for people to understand that there is this very clear chain of command. What was fascinating about this freeze event, and I'm sitting on my couch watching it, normally you would see the Texas Department of Emergency Management in the forefront. And you have Texas Task Force One and all these other groups. Suddenly we were presented with people from ERCOT, and everybody went, who the heck is ERCOT? I mean, some of us knew, but the general public didn't. And then you had suddenly the PUC showing up and all these other people. So it was very confusing. And so unlike a hurricane, where I never thought I'd say this, but hurricanes are easy. We have that down to a fine art of how you deal with them. This freeze was totally different. And so it was several days before I saw Nim Kidd, for example. And Nim Kidd is the director of Texas Department of Emergency Management. And in my humble opinion, he's the best in the entire country. But we weren't dealing with TDEM. We were dealing with ERCOT and all these other players. And that's not part of the normal chain of command. And so Tammy ran into having to deal with people she wouldn't normally deal with. I'm sure all of us did. But it's important for anybody who wants to study this subject matter to understand the critical role of county judges. Because even in a place like Harris County, people know who the mayor is, But ultimately, it's the county judge's decision what goes on in the county. It's not the mayor's, although it's good to defer to a mayor for their city if at all possible.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Professor Emmett. Marcus, would you like to ask that question that we received from Kathy Wainwright of University College London?
Yes, gladly. So Katie was asking a question in regards to resilience and planning with regards to previous crises in 2011 or 1989, where severe weather has also had an effect on power supply. And she was wondering if those events informed current emergency preparedness for the state, and to what extent this unique management of the Texan electrical grid with ERCOT impact the state's ability to be resilient against critical infrastructure loss and the cascading effects of disasters would be. And I would give that to the panel, whoever wants to go first. I don't know if Dr. Jones wants to has some insight into this first.
Sure. So the unique nature of the Texas energy grid, and I don't claim to be an expert on this, but there have been many things that have been identified very quickly. There's a fundamental problem of winterization. There was no incentive built into the system to winterize. Also, the limited power sharing. My understanding is that there is some power sharing, but it's quite limited. And as a result of that, that can lead to a situation in which the system might have been more resilient had it been able to purchase power from other portions of the grid around the country. More broadly, there's a broader issue I would like to talk about at some point, which is that we haven't spent on infrastructure in this country in quite some time. The 1930s and 40s, and I had family members who got jobs with the WPA in that period. These were people who were willing to work and were suddenly out of work in the Great Depression, and there was massive infrastructure buildup. I went to a middle school, and the building was more than 100 years old. And in the auditorium was this beautiful artwork, sculptures that had been done by artists employed by the WPA during the 1930s. Really amazing projects. And we built a lot of infrastructure in this country in the 1930s. And we built a lot of infrastructure in this country, particularly in terms of transportation infrastructure with the interstate highway system in the 1950s under Eisenhower. And what paid for much of that was a very high progressive income tax system. People don't realize that in the 1950s, if you look at the tax structure in the United States, the top 1% or the top marginal tax rate was in the 90% range. And people hear that and they get this shocked. Now, nobody ever paid that. There were deductions that were very broad, but they paid higher rates than they do now. We made large investments in infrastructure. We have been living on borrowed infrastructure for quite some time in this country. The United States brings in about 26% of GDP in taxation. The OECD average is at least 34%. And when you look at countries that I study, like Mexico, which is only at 16%, various Central American countries, which are down to 12 and 14%, at some point you start to notice a pattern, which is taxation is important. You need functioning law enforcement. You need, which we fortunately have. We have very good law enforcement and court systems. But we haven't been making long-term investments in infrastructure. And so we had to take a step back and say, well, our emergency managers did great in the moment with the situation that they had. But why were they in the situation that they had? Why? Why was there a shortage of power? Now, understanding that the Texas electrical grid is cut off from most of the rest of the country in most ways, it's not completely cut off, but in most ways, you can make a homeland security argument for compartmentation or from architectural theory. You've all seen the scene in the submarine movie where they're cutting off a section of the submarine to prevent and sacrificing one portion of the submarine to prevent the rest of the submarine from sinking. You have fire doors in buildings to compartment and cut off danger from one portion of another to another. So we could imagine, say, a hack that hits the American electrical grid. Having a compartmented portion of the grid could have value. But in this case, it seems to have made the whole system far less resilient in the sense that it couldn't engage in power sharing. And so, once upon a time in the 1950s, there were presidential campaigns that talked about a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Well, we could have solar panels on every roof, an electric battery with 2 to 3 days of power storage in every home, an electric car in every garage, and we could have and invest in power storage capability. And that is one thing that is really interesting. People think Tesla is a car company. It's not. It's an energy company. That's the big idea. The idea of power storage and creating a more resilient grid or a more resilient power storage system. That's going to require also massive investments in some kind of a smart grid system in which it's easier to handle transfers of power in different ways. And I'm not an electrical engineer. So, I'm not going to be able to go into those details, but we know that we're going to need to make those investments. But the way I look at it is those could be champagne problems. Whereas if we have a distributed power system that is more resilient, then our problem will become, well, how do we prevent the grid operators from going out of business? Because we're still going to need a grid. But that becomes a champagne problem. How are we going to regulate the system so that we can make sure that grid operators stay in business, despite the fact that we're generating enough power in a decentralized fashion that we can create a more resilient grid? So imagine I lose power to my house. Well, my home battery kicks on because it's been powered up and stored because of the solar panels on my roof that have been storing power. That would make the whole system a lot more resilient. And there are a lot of ways, and I'd be happy to talk about how to fund that and we can go into that, but I don't want to monopolize too much time. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I would be interested in what Professor Emmett would say to this, if he thinks like how Texas has been resilient in the power grid.
Well, let me pick up on some of what Dr. Jones said. As a former Republican legislator, I'm perhaps as aware as anybody of the no new taxes approach in Texas. The problem with that is, and I will say it bluntly, if everybody runs for office every election saying, I'm going to lower your taxes, well, once the party's been in power for a quarter of a century, there's nothing left to lower. And in fact, whether you're talking about the gasoline tax, the funding of highways, moving to a different tax, the fact that now the state is trying to limit how much cities and counties rely only on a property tax, and you can't keep doing that. I mean, there's the old saying about, you keep cutting and cutting and cutting, and eventually you're cutting into the bone, and that's where we are. And people have got to admit that in Texas. Now, the answer to it with regard to the electrical grid was more of an out of sight, out of mind philosophy. Both parties, I will say, got convinced that we had to do away with the monopolies in electric power. We used to have Houston Lighting and Power in Houston. They did everything. They generated, they supplied, they distributed. And then that was bad. That led to the creation of the Public Utility Commission. Suddenly, cogeneration had to be part of the system. Wind power had to be part of the system. And everybody thought this was going to be great. And then on the Republican side, the conservative side, people said, deregulation is going to be great because it's going to lower the cost of electricity. Well, without getting into all the economics of it, the competition might have driven down the rate, but what it did was it cut off the incentive to invest in backup power. And so what we had and what we have now is a system that's not at all resilient and doesn't have the backup generation capacity. And a lot of people sign contracts for, marginal rates that could skyrocket. I believe the high got to be $9,000 per megawatt. And so now the state Senate is saying, oh, no, that's horrible. We can't make people pay that. Well, you set it up that way. So if a company signed contracts based on that, can you go abrogate all those contracts? So I think, what Dr. Jones said was right. We have just kind of ignored infrastructure, and we've been living on borrowed time for a long time. And so this is just one example. It's not just in this. It's in roads and bridges and everything else in the state of Texas. So we're gonna have to invest, and unless somebody can produce a ferry that's going to come down from on high and grace us with a lot of money to rebuild our infrastructure in Texas, then we're going to be in trouble for a while. I hate to admit that.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Emmett.
Sorry.
Of course. No, Dr. Jones, the floor is yours.
Brief comment. We talk so much about polarization. I'm sorry, Tammy. We talk so much about polarization in our country, but I'm pretty liberal, and Professor Emmett's a conservative, and we can agree on this. So if we can agree on this, I'm very, very hopeful about where our country can go very soon. And so, Tammy, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to chime in real quick on that.
I don't claim to know anything about infrastructures and electrical infrastructure, but there's two things that I know has happened down in here in South Texas because of this. One is we've had a lot of wind power. We put in a lot of the wind power has become huge down here. And my understanding is wind power failed during this whole process. It was not able to generate the electricity that was needed. That's what I've heard down here. The other was that we have in the city of Brownsville, we have a public utilities board, and they actually had a generator that was on kind of mothballs, and they took it out of mothballs and actually did produce electricity and sold that back. Now the representatives that are elected to that board for the Public Utilities Board are very, very concerned because if the public finds out that electricity didn't come to the city of Brownsville, which was without power for several days, but they actually sold it somewhere else, they're concerned that they may not themselves either get reelected to their position or reappointed to that position because they made that decision that, to go ahead and reactivate this generator and to sell power because it was needed to be sold, but it didn't go to the citizens of Brownsville, which is where it resides. Those are just two comments they may be true or not true. So,
Dr. Jones.
Real quick. So while some wind turbines definitely did fail, wind turbines can function quite well in cold weather environments. We know that they work in the Netherlands. They can be winterized. And it is my understanding that natural gas power plants and nuclear power plants also suffered significant setbacks due to a lack of winterization. So I think that this is a broader issue on the issue of winterization than just wind turbines versus natural gas versus nuclear. They all, across the board, could have been winterized and were not. And I'll pitch it to Professor.
Good. Yes, they could have all been winterized. And when people study what happened, the South Texas nuclear project went down. For whatever reason, I don't know. I've not been able to figure that out. But South Texas nuclear project is, I believe, like 80% jointly owned by San Antonio and Austin. And so that immediately caused a problem in those two areas. The wind turbines, and I confess I'm not a big fan of wind-generated energy, but they are not expected. The grid has to take whatever they provide. But in the case of winter, I want to say that it's cut way back as to what they're supposed to provide. All systems failed. The gas failed. And not only the gas generating plants, but the gas system itself that was to provide the gas to the gas generating plants in the gas fields. And so the whole thing was not winterized, but there was no incentive to. You've got to get back to the fact that if everything is going to be on the lowest cost basis, and you own a business and you're competing with other businesses, the first thing you're going to do is not pay extra for things like winterization and backup generation. That's the issue that's got to be addressed. Somehow that's got to be built into the rates going forward so that companies that supply the power have an incentive to have backup power.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Emmett. Going back to response just a little bit, or really quickly, posing this to Randall, Tammy, being responders yourselves, as well as both Professor Emmett and Dr. Jones being able to kind of just watch everything happen over the course of that week. Did we have the resources necessary to even address this disaster in the first place? You guys touched a little bit on future-proofing, winterization, and going into whether or not you guys had resources now. What can be done for the future?
This is Randall over at Collin County. I personally don't feel like we had the resources at the time of need. We have generators all across the state. We have access to generators all across the state. We have access to water all across the state. Judge Emmett, Professor Emmett's been through this numerous times in a hurricane. That stuff is surged into our state and into our regions days ahead. We don't even really think about it. It's there. Yep, you may have to wait a few hours to get that generator or that water, but you know it's coming. This event, that stuff wasn't here for whatever reason. And then when it was here, wasn't where it was needed. And then you couldn't move it on the roads because a lot of the roads were impassable due to snow and ice and everything else on the roads. The other thing that came up, you weren't able to move them. Diesel engines gelled over because we don't use winter fuel down here like they do up north. So I don't feel like we had the resources where we needed them. I think that was for multiple reasons. I think it was we all went into this as, it's going to be cold, it's going to be snowy. We're not going to be able to leave our house for a few days. We may lose power a few times because they were talking, the blackouts, rolling. And we're going to be good to go. And to chime off to that, even Sunday night, ERCOT, put out a tweet. Max, highest winter demand ever. We made it through. We're good to go. Everything's, looking good. And our electric co-op even said we've sent our staff home because we're not going to have to do the rolling blackouts. Well, then the power generation failed for lots of reasons, as has been discussed. So I think the way we assumed our planning and went into this, we did not have the right resources in the right places. And on that note, I think it's hard to know where those resources needed to be. If I can't move a generator even 15 miles, I don't know which water pumps are going to fail. We had no way to know where exactly those were going to need to be. Now, could we have got them down to a county level? Yes, but outside of that, it was anybody's guess. So, from my point of view, the resources are there, but they weren't in the right place at the right time. And then I'm going to go to kind of what Dr. Jones said. And I'll admit I tend to be on the conservative side, but I totally agree with him. We shouldn't even had to be dealing with these things if the infrastructure was maintained and supported correctly over the years.
And thank you, Randall. Tammy, from the NGO side, would you like to add anything about the Red Cross and whether y'all had the resources or even support or not only support, but working conjointly with FEMA?
Yeah, there's a lot of pre-planning that goes into a lot of disaster preparedness. I mean, that is definitely something that we do continuously, and we do have resources available. But when you get into catastrophic events such as this type of event, those resources become extremely precious. And then if you get into the issue of you can't move stuff, and we saw that in Hurricane Harvey was another big problem. We could get the stuff to the state line, but we couldn't get it across the river because of the flooding and those type of things. So when you can't move the stuff, even though you've got the best plans in the world and you've got stuff, you just can't get it to where it needs to be. And you end up being very, very creative on how you get things moved. I didn't consider, but I have in Harvey, I ended up using helicopters to move water out to Galveston Island because they needed water and we couldn't get it over there. And that was how I got my people and my water out there. But we never got to that level of having that kind of a discussion. We were able to eventually get water once we got it into the state and could get out and start working with the counties. We were able to get the water.
Let me follow up on that with regard. I was sort of in the middle of Harvey. The state system failed not because of anything the state did. Harvey made landfall south down toward Corpus Christi. Mm-hmm. So the state sent their resources there. And by the time people realized Harvey, when it got to the Houston area and Beaumont area, wasn't a hurricane, it was just a flood event. Mm-hmm. Well, we know where to evacuate and what to do with a hurricane because you know where the storm surge is. But when the whole area is getting 50 inches of rain, you have no idea even where to set up shelters. The Red Cross, no offense, weren't helpful at all because they're a volunteer organization and their people were all trapped. Mm-hmm. So, we had to cobble together things. But my favorite example of it was I got a call from a county judge 2 counties north of Harris County saying, we have some people trapped in an elementary school. They don't have any cots. They don't have any MREs, meals ready to eat. They have water, but we'd rather have some bottled water. We don't have any blankets. We don't have any supplies. And we can't get through to the state. Can you get through to them? And I said, well, it won't do you any good because the state can't come help us. So I turned to my logistics manager and I said, you handle this. And her solution was a Harris County truck just took a wrong turn and ended up 2 counties north with supplies from Harris County. Did I have the authority to do that? No. Was it the right thing to do? Absolutely. And so she got all kinds of gold stars in my book for just taking it upon herself and helping a neighbor. Well, fast forward to this event. It's a totally different event. And politics being what politics are, I can guarantee you, if there had been another administration, people would have been yelling, where's FEMA? Where's FEMA? Where's FEMA? We didn't hear any of that. But I asked the question, where was FEMA? They weren't here. Now, it was a new administration. There wasn't even a named person in charge of DHS. But the example I gave was, after the fact, what was really needed in Houston was copper tubing because of all the water breaks. FEMA could have done great by just setting up a place for the plumbers to come get copper tubing to fix the water breaks. But that's not in the playbook anywhere. So one of the things we have to do is make sure that the playbook, and to all the students here, if you end up in this business, stay flexible. Don't get so wrapped up in, well, gee, all I deliver are MREs and water and ice. No, sometimes it's going to be copper tubing that needs to be delivered, and that would have helped us a lot. So in my personal situation, I told you we had a pipe break. I went to Victoria, and Victoria had all kinds of copper tubing. So all we had to do was realize what's the need and then match that need up with where the supplies are. And nobody was doing that, and that's a job that FEMA really should do.
Thank you, Professor Emmett. Speaking of FEMA, we did get a question from Ken Smith, which touches on FEMA just a little bit. And his question was, could and should have FEMA played a bigger role in addressing the incident, helping out the entire state? And on top of that, should they have been activated or had bigger involvement helping with just this crisis in general? And that question is posed to our entire panel. Whoever would like to go first, feel free to answer.
I'll jump in here first. One thing that a lot of people don't understand with FEMA is there are dollar thresholds that must be met in damages and individual damage thresholds that must be met for governments to get money on the public assistance or the PA side, and then homeowners, IA assistance on the individual side. And then both of those programs are broken down into different categories and funding streams. FEMA was very early to give us what they call an emergency declaration and allowing governments to spend limited amounts of money on sheltering and doing emergency work, keeping government going, basically, relatively speaking, summarizing. During the middle of the event, FEMA opened it up to a major declaration, still only what they call Category B emergency work for government, but then they also opened up the individual assistance portal very early. We've seen after many disasters, FEMA or locals trying to get that IA money turned on, because FEMA wants to usually see so many homes damaged where the people are uninsured or underinsured and don't have the resources to rebuild or repair. And on this one, they turned it on very early. Collin County was included in that declaration. And so our homeowners, that don't have insurance can apply. On the PA side, that is where that hard dollar amount is. For the state of Texas right now, it's over $38 million in public uninsured losses before going by the book, before FEMA starts opening money up. And we're actually in a struggle right now. Category B has been turned on, but none of the other categories have been turned on. Debris, fixing the buildings that are damaged, repairing roads, doing what they call permanent work. None of that's been turned on, and we're working very hard as counties in the state to get that turned on. And then the counties have a threshold to meet too. And Collin County is a little over 3 million. It's based on per capita. So Harris County has a much higher threshold to hit before FEMA turns on, that spigot. So to say FEMA be here earlier, in some ways it's kind of hard when you're going, by the book. We see FEMA get turned on very early during hurricanes, but we also know following a hurricane, we're going to have lots of debris. We're going to have lots of home damage. We know that's going to be there. And debris is typically an uninsured loss, so we know we're going to hit those thresholds. But the IA side usually takes a little while to get turned on because they have to go through and verify these people actually have a need. And I'm going to jump back to 2019 here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We had a major tornado outbreak, went right through the north part of Dallas. We did not hit our threshold for that for a lot of different reasons. And we can talk politics, we can talk, the gaming of the system and all that, but it was not turned on. And so, to say FEMA not here quick enough, I personally don't put it on there because they are going by a playbook that's there for a reason. Another thing FEMA does not typically do is pay for sanding and de-icing, spraying the roads. Mm-hmm. They typically will do that, or they will do that after what they call a snow of significance, which the National Weather Service determines what's a snow of significance. Well, when you look at how much snow we got here in Collin County, it was 3 to 4 inches. That's not an uncommon event for us up here. Now, the cold was the problem. So all those sanding, de-icing, is on the local dollar. People go, whoa, FEMA should help pay for that. But on the flip side, if FEMA paid for that, you take a state like Oklahoma that has a very low disaster threshold because their population is much lower. Every time they get a snowstorm, FEMA could be coming in and paying the de-icing costs, and that's not FEMA's goal. FEMA's goal is a funding of last resort, and we should do everything we can, as both homeowners and government, not to go to FEMA. There may be other funding streams. So should maybe some things been pre-positioned earlier? Yes, but I also don't think that, we look at this like a hurricane, and everybody has said this. This was a very unique event. And I'm going to chime in even what Judge Emmett was talking about Harris County. Up here, we woke up Saturday morning after landfall going, whoa, hurricane wasn't too terrible. The media is having a hard time even finding damage around Corpus in that Victoria area. Houston, they're around all the bayous and looking, whoa, everything's good. But we all know what happened that night. It went downhill very quickly and very severely. So it wasn't even the hurricane in their case. It was the rain and the flooding that was their issue. It was a unique event. And same thing here. It was a very unique event that it was all of it coming together to get where we were. So I don't necessarily believe FEMA should have been here any earlier because we didn't know what was going to happen. If people disagree, totally understand. That's just my perspective.
I hate to jump in again, but I almost have to. From an educator point of view, we as a country and as a state are still trying to sort out what is the role of the government in disasters. It wasn't until 1992 that the White House really got involved in hurricanes, for example. Hurricane Andrew hit Florida, and it was an election year, and suddenly people said, well, why isn't the president doing anything? And President George H.W. Bush at the time kind of worked under the assumption of, well, that's something that local governments and Red Cross and people like that take care of. I had in 1983, Hurricane Alicia hit the Houston area. I had a tree across my house, damage all over the place. I was in the legislature, and if FEMA existed, I didn't even know it. I mean, you didn't immediately look to the government to come bail you out. That has changed. And so we're still sorting it out as to who's in charge, what's the role. And so hurricanes, yes, we said that works. Ice storms, particularly a place like Texas, up north, they would look at the ice storm and the freeze we just went through and go, really? Why was that a major event? And so I think the politics are always going to be there now. They weren't prior to 1992. And since I feel obligated to I mentioned New London, Texas earlier. Many of you don't know what happened there, but yesterday, March 18th, 1937, the school blew up. It killed almost 300 people. Still the largest school disaster in American history, and it was because natural gas accumulated underneath, and it was odorless. Well, because of that explosion, you can now smell natural gas. They've added an odorizer to it. And for the first time, people started paying attention to how natural gas was regulated because of that disaster. But in that disaster, it was the local oil companies and businesses that provided all the equipment to, drag people out of the debris and help clear it up. There was really no government involvement. So over the years, one of the things, and again, I'm speaking to the students here as much as anything else, we've got to be clear, and I'd be curious to hear what Marcus might have to say about how Germany handles it. We're still wrestling with what is the exact role of government versus insurance versus private NGOs when it comes to a disaster.
Well, I'd be very happy to chip in. We have government organizations who deal with this, the THW, that is basically tasked in helping, similar to FEMA, but they have a clear task. So whenever a catastrophe happens, we know that we can use the THW, we can use other institutions, and if need be, we just use the army to help with, such as the Oder flooding a couple of years ago. So we have clear-cut roles in Germany for now. While we see with the next catastrophe or the crisis how this will hold up, because I think our critical infrastructure hasn't been tested for a long time, and I'm not sure if those mechanisms are still really well in place. But Dr. Jones wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, I wanted to chip in. We've said a few things that I think are really interesting. I really want to chime in on some of the things Randall Gurney brought up, and one of the things is unique events. Well, we're going to see a lot more unique events because there's two words we haven't brought up: climate change. This is the new normal. These unique events are going to happen more and more, and they're not going to be unique anymore. So we better be taking notes very quickly that Hurricane Harvey, it's not really a hurricane, it's a massive flooding event. And we're going to need to build out that water infrastructure and possibly raise taxes so that we have the capability to store more water on the fly quickly. And I might be wrong, but Professor Emmett, I believe that you proposed some of these things. And I remember cheering at the time. I said, yes. Yes. Now, tell me if I'm wrong. I don't want to mischaracterize, but I remember you saying you were hoping to have the ability to be able to build out more of that infrastructure. Now, the other thing that, Collin County Emergency Management just brought up is this key issue of market failure within the insurance industry. So debris isn't covered by your insurance. Why are they allowed to sell policies that don't cover those things? Oh, the private insurance companies don't like to cover floods, so the government has to do it. That's what we call market failure. That's a failure of the free market to provide a needed service. So we could step in with a regulation and say, well, I know you don't want to sell flood insurance, but you're going to have to do that. Price it in for everybody across the board. You can vary your prices if people live in flood zones. Update your flood maps, get that straight, because climate change is happening and those flood maps are all out of date now. But this idea that FEMA is supposed to step in, all I'm seeing is a lot of private sector market failures. Now, on the other hand, there's a counter argument to be made. If the private insurance companies don't want to insure, are you living in an area where maybe you shouldn't be living? I.e., are you living so close to the WUI, the wildlife urban interface, that your house is going to burn? And the insurance companies know that. and Professor Emmett, I love his pine log cabin as the background. That's the perfect background for this moment, right? So we've got the WUI, but also coastal land that we know is going to potentially flood on a regular basis, and insurance companies just don't want to pay for it. Is that a market failure, or is that a success of the market sending a signal of information into the system like, hey, you shouldn't be living here or live here at your own risk? Now, another issue. How are people living without homeowners insurance? Are you allowed to drive a car without car insurance? But you can own a home and not be insured? Well, maybe that should be built into your tax bill and a tax lien if you're not paying for it. Every problem is fixable. Just come to me. No, I'm just kidding. I'll leave it there.
Tammy, you can feel free to just jump in.
Okay. I have a couple of things. I could probably talk for several hours when you could talk about FEMA and disasters and so forth. But I will tell you that having done lots of large-scale disasters where FEMA does come in, FEMA was on the ground early in this. To me, it was amazing. And how they were on the ground was they were on the ground mainly with immediate assistance. They were offering 2 months of rental property, assistance, so that we could get people moved out of those homes that they were not going to be able to live in because of the pipes and everything else. We ended up, FEMA has a process you have to go through, and it is not unusual that the first time people file for it, because oftentimes the people that are in these situations are people that are not necessarily, they're elderly. It's a very diverse population. They're maybe not as educated. Therefore, their access to having computers and how to fill out online and things like that. And so we had initially, FEMA was on the ground and they were taking in applications, but people were getting denied because they didn't know how to fill it out. And so we know from Red Cross is that oftentimes we have to go in and help them to go back. You've got to go back and keep reapplying because you've just not filled out something quite right in the application process itself. So I was really very pleased to see that they jumped on so fast, because that was another tool that we had that could get people moved out of those substandard problems that they had in their homes and get some kind of a resolution with it. Damage assessment is huge, and that is something that initially when a disaster happens in the United States, the first people that are in those areas is the Red Cross. And we do preliminary damage assessment. We work very closely with the government and elected officials, but those initial damage assessment numbers go into FEMA. And so that helps, hopefully helps to get things started a little bit faster. Unfortunately, on this particular disaster, the type of damage that we're seeing is not the damage that is normally what we measure as major and destroyed. And I can tell you that for the whole state of Texas, from a major and destroyed, where the homes were truly determined to be major and destroyed, it was 45. That was 45 homes that we had. And we're dealing with, in Texas, particularly in the Texas Gulf Coast region, you're dealing with a very educated population of people they're used to disasters, happening, and they know what the Red Cross does, and so they actually call us and let us know. I mean, we immediately opened up a call center to take in those calls, and had over 5,000 calls that came in with that, and so my DA team worked on that piece with it. But for pipes breaking in the homes, that's not considered major. That is an affected damage, but it's not considered to be a major with that. We also worked we got really out of the box in this type of thinking with our partners, our other non-governmental organizations. When a disaster happens, the Baptists and the Methodist men stand up. They help muck out homes, and they help do repairs. You've got the Habitat for Humanity that does that. So we reached out both at the national level as well as at in all throughout the whole state of Texas to those partners that we have, and saying, hey, are you looking at bringing in any plumbers or doing any kind of plumbing, drywall, and those type of repairs? We do sheltering. That's what we do. And we can, we could, number one, open a shelter for plumbers to stay in if that's what you like, or we could teach you how to set up a shelter so they could stay in it, because they're going to be coming for several weeks. The plan I put together and actually pursued for 10 days with my partners was to try to bring that to fruition for 90 days. That we would actually support their efforts in bringing plumbers in. The answer we got back was the supplies aren't here. Therefore, we can't really do it right now. And we're interested, but it's going to be very piecemeal. And so I wasn't able to really make that happen before I ended up having to stand down the initial response of this. Now, we've now moved into what we call long-term recovery for this. And so we're looking at that as a piece that will be in the long-term recovery, again, working with the other non-governmental organizations that would possibly be bringing in plumbers into the state with that. So that's kind of where we stand at this point. Lastly, I just wanted to say, Red Cross, we've taken the stand that we have moved from what used to be an acute disaster. You'd see disasters and they'd happen, and then they'd go away, and then we'd maybe see the next one a while later. We've now moved into what we call chronic disasters. And we saw that last year where we started with Hurricane Hannah, we went into Hurricane Laura, we then followed that with Delta, and we followed that with Zeta. And this year is going to be very similar. And so we are actually all just starting to change our whole thought process in now how is our response going to become a chronic response. It's not an immediate response. It is literally a chronic response. I saw that in Delta. I was the job director on Delta, which came in 18 miles away from where landfall was for Laura. So it was pretty much the same area, same impact with that. And so, we ended up building a disaster on top of a previous disaster with it. And so that's a whole new set of skills that we're learning how to do. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Tammy. I wanted to go back to when we started. You said that coming out of this Texas freeze, there are lessons learned, definitely, and you come out stronger. Now, we've had Dr. Jones saying we live in the new normal with climate change and extreme weather events will become more common. And you just said also, Tammy, that we're in the middle of chronic disasters and chronic response. And I'm interested, like before we wrap it up, to see how have the lessons learned be. Will you in Texas be more prepared in the future for such extreme weather events? Do you still feel there's much to be done? And if there's much to be done, what would that be? And I think let's go to Randall first.
I tend to agree. I think we will see more events, even from just a standpoint of population spread. Even with things changing, but in population spread, I'll go back in Collin County. 20 years ago. Or even 15 years ago, the city of McKinney was less than 100,000 people. It's pushing 200,000 now. And so, 15, 20 years ago, that tornado that went across, or that hailstorm that went across, tore up some farmland, tore up a couple fences, maybe killed some livestock, tore up a barn. No one may have even known about the tornado, especially if you start looking even further back in history. You take away our technology with radar and all that. And so even if we did know about it, it wasn't that impactful, to humans. But now we fast forward to our urban sprawl and our population increases, and you see on the news all the time, everybody's moving to Texas. And so now that event that kind of got, swept under the rug, or it was bad up north a little bit, is having real impacts on people. I do think government and agencies and NGOs and people are trying to prepare better. But then I'm also going to jump on to what some other comments have been made. What is government's role? And why aren't we forcing people to have homeowners insurance or building codes? Why aren't we making sure that building codes are done properly so we lessen those impacts? Those things do occur, but you're insured properly, so you're not making that call to FEMA. You're not making that call to your local government. You're not making that call to the Red Cross going, I have nowhere to go tonight. I have no money. I can't get a hotel, even for a simple fire, not even a disaster. So I kind of think it's too, multifaceted in a way. I think we're seeing more of it for whatever reason, but also for the urban sprawl, and we're spreading out. I also think, folks are trying to be better prepared, but then we run into that same stumbling block that we do with infrastructure. No one wants to pay for it. I have homeowners insurance at my home, so why should I have to pay higher taxes? Because this person, my neighbor, doesn't have insurance, and now they may need a hotel. So same thing with the bridge. Well, I never use that bridge, or we never have this issue with power, so why should we pay more taxes in it? So we have to invest in it. We have to be, willing to do that investment. And I think folks are. There's funding streams available. I wouldn't be opposed to, requiring people to have required to have some level of preparedness. It's as simple as insurance, making sure you're properly insured. And like I said, even a house fire, we had a house burning down in our neighborhood, and the people were not able to move back in their home because they were not insured properly. They had a mortgage, but none of their contents were covered. So they had nothing to move back in with. So they had to sell their home. So I think we are trying to prepare. I do appreciate what Dr. Jones said. We call them unique. You'll hear a phrase in your career, black swan events. It's really not that anymore. It is becoming more the norm that, we are trying to prepare for, but each one's so different. The last one doesn't necessarily answer all the questions to the future ones. So I think some of it is also back on individuals being educated and knowing how to prepare for themselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Randall. Judge Emmett, let's hear your.
Okay, and I know we're getting up against time, so I'll try and be fairly quick. Clearly, the population change is important. I did an interview with the New York Times following Harvey, and they wanted to talk about the flooding in the Cypress area of Harris County. They said, "Oh, there's never been a flood like that." And I said, "How do you know?" And they thought I was just some bumpkin. I said, 20 years ago, nobody lived there. And the cows didn't tell you whether it flooded out there or not. And now we've got 10 Class 5A high schools in that neighborhood. So, yeah, I'm not even sure they're unique events. And I do really regret that there are people out there who just want to deny that there's any climate change going on. I mean, I'm sorry, the satellite photos of the polar caps aren't lying to us. They're not made up. We know that. But if it gets into that discussion, you got a lot of people who just don't even want to talk about it. So we are having events. So how do we prepare for them? Mention building codes. Everybody has their water heater in the attic. Well, that's not a good idea. And it was that caused as many problems as anything else. So that's a simple change to say, look, if you're going to put the water heater in the attic, then you have to have all kinds of insulation, and it needs to be prepared. FEMA flood insurance. I have to have flood insurance on this cabin because it's next to water. But it's a constant level lake. Harvey didn't come within 8 feet of this cabin, but yet FEMA requires it. Why is that so difficult to get those maps right? And then finally, and this really will strike some people the wrong way, government regulation really needs to be implemented. Following Hurricane Ike, if you looked at the Bolivar Peninsula near Galveston, there was only one home left standing. There's a wonderful greenhouse. It was the only one left, and everything else had been wiped out. You go there today, they've all rebuilt. But the next hurricane's going to the same thing. So whether you have stronger building codes or whether you say, look, if you build in a place like this, you're on your own. Don't expect somebody to come pay for your decision to put a house on a spit of land in the Gulf of Mexico. It doesn't make sense. So I just think policymakers are going to have to address these issues. And yeah, there's got to be some money spent.
And would Tammy or Dr. Jones, would you like to comment as well?
Tammy, go ahead.
I only have one other little comment I'll make, and that is that thank heavens FEMA has started to look at these areas that are being re-impacted. I can tell you a couple of counties I know in Texas that flood on a regular basis. The flooding's going to happen, and the people who built their homes, they built them up on high rise. They have their boats, and when it floods, they take the car over to the other side and they boat over. They've asked us to, we bring our heater meals. They actually asked me one time to put them in a boat and have them take them to their homes. And we said, absolutely not. I mean, there's wildlife in that water and there's all sorts of other things. And if you choose to stay in your home because they don't want to leave it because of looters, that you're going to have to come to where we're putting our food. And with that, and then the comments is, well, I ran out of heater reels from the last time you were here. So the last time I did a disaster in that area, it was I was happy to hear that FEMA was saying, you know what, we paid you, and therefore you're not eligible for anything else, any other assistance. Now, is that going to cause them to move? No. These homes, they've been in the families for decades, and they don't choose to move. They want to live in that environment. So I think it's a tough discussion's going to have to happen, and we're going to have to take some tough stands on some of that situations. So that's all I have to say. Back to you.
Dr. Jones, would you like to close out the panel with your comments?
Yeah, so just a few things. I really liked some of the things Professor Emmett was talking about. We end up paying for it one way or another. We're going to either pay for it through taxes or we're going to pay through insurance premiums. And we need to kind of get out of the mindset that, oh, it's someone else's problem. It's our, like I'm going to assess my own risk. I once listened to a person talk about that they were unhappy with the ACA, Affordable Care Act, because it eliminated their insurance plan, and that they were a healthy, middle-aged adult, and they had chosen an insurance plan that didn't cover their kidneys, and it saved them a lot of money. And I thought to myself, I'm going to pay for his kidneys. Because when he can't pay for it, when something goes wrong with his kidneys and he has an insurance plan that doesn't cover his kidneys, it's going to fall onto my premiums. So either we're going to pay through it through a socialized taxation system, or we're going to end up paying for it through the insurance premiums. And in many ways, there's a lot of economics research out there that's saying, hey, choice is overrated. Once something gets really, really complicated, like an insurance plan or really complex electricity plans that people can't understand, once an average Joe can't understand the nature of their plans, once financial instruments, for example, become very, very complex to the point where, financiers can't understand them and are surprised that they've lost a lot of money in a financial collapse because they didn't understand the implications of the contracts that they bought. Once people can't understand something, the market's not really functioning well. So to have a good, well-functioning market, in John Maynard Keynes, the average person, and I'm paraphrasing, has to understand what's going on. If the average person can't understand the stock market, there's something wrong with it. And so we need to make insurance pretty straightforward through regulation. We need to consider expanding it. Why are people choosing whether or not to have flood insurance? I live in an area that supposedly is not a flood area, but I can look at a map. I know where the San Jacinto River is. And granted, I can throw a rock at a Starbucks from my house, and I'm assuming that their corporate researchers didn't want to put a Starbucks where it's going to flood, but I still buy the flood insurance. And you know what? Flood insurance might be cheaper if everybody was required to buy the flood insurance. And so I would like to end by thanking Professor Emmett for being required to buy flood insurance in a house that will probably never flood and subsidizing the cost of my flood insurance.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. And with that, I'd like to end actually with one last question by Ken Smith directed to Judge Emmett. His question is, when are you planning to run for governor to help address and fix some of these issues discussed today?
I think it's a good thing to end on, and we'll just move on down the road. I'm happy at the Baker Institute, and but these are the issues that people do have to address. And it's up to all of you to make sure that they get addressed, and don't let people get by with just the simple non-answers going forward. But I do appreciate it.
Yeah, and with that,
please send my best to everyone at the Baker Institute.
Will do.
With that, I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time out of their Friday afternoons to come talk to us about emergency management and how we can address not only the Texas freeze if it does happen again, but also in the long-term future disasters and whether these unique events are going to be more and more frequent. And Marcus, do you have any closing comments?
I just want to thank the panel for, as you already said, Joshua, taking out the time on this Friday to talk to us. And I think we all learned a lot. Like, I definitely made a lot of notes today, and it was great. It was a great conversation, and I'm really thankful that you were here today on this panel. And with this, say again, thank you. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you again on another webinar.